Hello everyone, welcome to the second video for Chapter 2, Chemistry of Life. This is Biology with Mrs. Scott. We are going to start talking today a little more about macromolecules. Now in class on Wednesday, I gave you guys the definition of a macromolecule, which is just a very, very large molecule. Now today, I want to talk to you more about the different macromolecules that living things require and the functions of each of those, and also a little bit about where we get those different macromolecules that we need to live. Now this slideshow is a little long. We talk a lot about macromolecules, so please feel free to break it up and watch it in chunks so that you don't get tired of writing or exhausted from taking notes. So the first thing we need to understand is how macromolecules are formed, and to do this we have to understand a little bit about chemical reactions. Now chemical reactions occur in order to form the macromolecules that we require, and also to make solutions, and they take place for different processes to actually happen in our bodies. Now the typical format of a chemical reaction is a reactant or reactants going in, having some kind of change occur here in the center, and then product or products being formed. So a reactant is basically what goes in, and a product is what comes out. Another example here is the photosynthesis equation. So we have water and carbon dioxide going in as reactants, and then glucose and oxygen being produced in that chemical reaction. Now, how do we get macromolecules? Well, we start off with very small pieces called monomers. So this is just a small molecule. A monomer is a small molecule. And then those small molecules, when they join together and form chains, we call those polymers. So a polymer is just a long chain molecule made up of a repeated pattern of those smaller units, those monomers. Now this is how we get our macromolecules, and these are the four that are most important to living things. The first is carbohydrates, and we're going to talk a little bit about where those come from and what they do. Proteins, lipids, and then nucleic acids. So let's get started by talking about carbohydrates. So carbohydrates contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and they do have a ratio that they usually appear in. Now monosaccharides are those carbohydrate molecules that are made up of only one sugar. And then polysaccharides are molecules that are made up of many sugars. So if you've ever heard someone talking about simple carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates, this is actually what they're talking about: monosaccharides and polysaccharides. Simple carbohydrates are simple sugars or monosaccharides. These are ones that we can use very quickly for energy. Complex carbohydrates provide a lot more for our bodies, but they take a little bit longer to break down. So the example that I want you guys to know for monosaccharides is glucose, and that's the equation or the formula for glucose. And then the examples that I would like you to know for polysaccharides are cellulose, starch, and glycogen, and we're going to talk a little bit about what those are. So what do carbohydrates do? Well, carbohydrates are delicious. So you have your fruit, you can have vegetables, and of course my favorite, which you could also put into the fat category, chocolate. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what they do. So carbohydrates supply energy. This is their biggest job. They burn glucose. Our cells burn glucose for energy needs. Glucose is our big source of energy in our bodies. Now, if we take up more energy or more glucose than we can use at one time, our cells store that glucose as something called glycogen, and then we can take extra supplies when we need that extra burst of energy. We can take that glycogen supply, it converts back into glucose, and we can use it for energy in our cells. Plants also store glucose, but they store it as starch. So things like potatoes have starch in them. They're very starchy foods. Okay, now carbohydrates also have or are structural. And the big structural carbohydrate I want you guys to know is cellulose. So plants use glucose to make this structural polysaccharide called cellulose, and it makes them sturdy. So anytime you guys see a plant, a vegetable, and it has a nice shape to it like celery, that is because of cellulose. Now, our bodies don't require cellulose. We can't digest it and we don't use it in our bodies. It's not something we require, but we can eat it. It doesn't hurt us. We just can't use it in any way. Okay, last function of carbohydrates, they help with cell identification. Now, this is one that you might not have thought of, but we have something called glycoproteins in our bodies, and these are embedded in the cell membranes of our cells, and they help our cells to recognize self, which means they can recognize whether or not that cell should be in the body or not. They have a protein and then a chain of sugar or a chain of carbohydrate attached to them, and they allow us to recognize whether something is supposed to be in our bodies or not. Now, they're important for blood typing. So anytime that you get a blood transfusion, you have to get a very specific type of blood so that it does not get rejected. Organ rejection, very similar. You have to have a very good match of an organ if you're ever going to get a transplant. Otherwise, your glycoproteins will stimulate your body to react and reject that organ. And then lastly, recognizing germs. Glycoproteins are very important in helping our bodies to recognize anything foreign and subsequently fight it off using an immune response. Okay, now we've talked about carbohydrates, yummy, but there's other really important macromolecules that we have to have as well that are much more important to us. And this next one is extremely important, proteins. So let's talk about proteins and how they're made. Now, proteins contain all four of those essential elements that all living things require: carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen. And they work together to form something called amino acid subunits. Now, I'm not going to require that you guys know the amino acid structure. I will not ask you, what is the amino group? What is the carboxyl group? This is not something you guys need to spend time learning or even copying down. But I want to show you the basic structure and how amino acids actually form. So the first thing we have is an amino group. Here in the green. Woo! The second part of an amino acid is the carboxyl group. And then the third part is what makes all different amino acids unique. So the R group is different for each amino acid. There are 20 different amino acids, and each one of them has something different in this R group spot. Okay, so this is alanine, and then we have serine. You can see there's a difference between those two right here. Okay, otherwise they have the same structure. All right, now what do proteins do? We all know a little something about proteins. Most of you guys would probably say we need it for our muscles, and that's absolutely true. But there's many other functions that proteins offer. So protein, most of the protein you get comes from, if you're a carnivore or an omnivore, you're eating things like meat, poultry, eggs, beans, fish, peanuts, and other kinds of nuts, and actually some types of grain offer offer a high amount of protein. Things like quinoa, which is a very trendy grain right now, actually is very high in protein. Okay, so once again, glycoproteins. I do want you guys to know glycoproteins. We are going to talk more about them this year. They're important. So again, these are the proteins that have sugars attached. They are in our cell membranes. Okay, now proteins are structural. So we do have other proteins that are in our cell membranes that help to do different things in our cells. Some of them help with transport. Others are just there for structural support. We have other proteins that combine with DNA and they wrap up into chromosomes. So DNA basically starts out as a tiny little double strand and finds these little proteins, which are called histones. You guys don't need to know that right now, but they're called histones. The DNA wraps around those histones and then eventually forms what we know as a chromosome. So this little X-shaped structure here is our chromosome. That's DNA tightly wound around many, many, many proteins. Now proteins act as enzymes. I'm going to lecture a little bit more on enzymes because you guys will need to know how they work for a lab that we're going to do next week. Now enzymes are just biological catalysts. What they do is they help chemical reactions to happen faster. And this is important in our bodies because as we're taking up food, we need to break that food down. So we actually have lots of digestive enzymes that will take pieces of that food, and they're very specific, and they'll break it down into something that's usable in our bodies. Now enzymes are kind of like recyclers. They will continue to break down their very specific substrate or their chemical that they're assigned to break down. But we're going to talk more about enzymes later on. Okay. Now proteins also control genes. This is something you guys don't have to know right now. But there's many different types of proteins that help to turn genes on and off. So we get genes from both mom and dad. We don't show the traits that both mom and dad have given us. We show one or the other. So one gene is always turned on, one is turned off. But more about that later when we talk about genetics and DNA. Now proteins also fight germs. This is a big one. You guys need to know what antibodies are. And we're going to talk a lot about antibodies next semester. So this is kind of a little intro for you guys. Now antibodies are proteins. They're proteins that our bodies produce in response to an exposure of a pathogen. So if we get this year's flu virus, we will produce antibodies that will help to fight that virus if it gets into our bodies a second or third time. Our antibodies will fight that off. The same thing is true if you get a vaccine. Antibodies are produced in response to that vaccine that you get. That means that when you get exposed to the actual pathogen instead of the vaccination, your body has already produced antibodies that will attack and kill the germ that you were vaccinated for. So very important. Okay, proteins aid in transport. This goes back to our cell membrane. Now we have lots of different proteins in the cell membrane, and they help to move materials into and out of the cell. Here's a little animation for you guys to see. Proteins they kind of stick out on both sides of that membrane, and they just act as a channel, going back and forth, letting in or out different materials. An important protein, as an example, is hemoglobin. This is a protein we have in our red blood cells, and it helps to carry oxygen to all of our body's cells. Without that hemoglobin, we wouldn't be able to oxygenate everything in our body. Okay, now proteins help with movement. This is where most of you guys go, oh, we need protein for muscles. That's exactly right. Our body muscles absolutely require protein. But there's all kinds of things in our bodies that also require protein. Um, Flagella on some types of cells, like sperm cells. You guys can see this animation here. That flagella is all made of little microfilament proteins. The mitotic spindle in mitosis and meiosis. When we talk about cell division, that spindle that pulls the chromosomes apart is made of protein. So proteins are really important in all kinds of movement in our bodies, both microscopic and macroscopic, the things that we can see every day. Okay, last function of proteins. Proteins act as hormones. Now, a great example that I like to use, because a lot of people have heard of it, is insulin. So insulin is a protein hormone, and it helps us to control our blood sugar. This protein hormone is actually produced naturally in our bodies. And when we eat a big load of food, a bunch of glucose basically, we need something that's going to break it down, and that insulin is what breaks it down. So our body produces it in response to our eating food or taking up more energy. Now, people do have to supplement it. People that have diabetes often have to supplement their insulin supply. It just means that their body doesn't produce enough. And they also often have to watch how much glucose and other carbohydrates they take in, so that they're not making their blood sugar go way up before they can have insulin help to break it down. Okay, we've talked about carbohydrates, we've talked about proteins. Let's talk about everybody's favorite, lipids. Yum, yum. Now, a lot of lipids are things that we really enjoy eating. They're not necessarily good for us. Some of them are. But things like bacon and butter are not really good for us, but darn, they're so good. So, lipids are mainly made from carbon and hydrogen. There's very few oxygen atoms in a lipid macromolecule. And if you guys notice up here at the top, in this chain, this lipid chain, there's actually only 2 oxygen molecules in this whole chain. The rest is carbon and hydrogen. Alright, now what do lipids do? Lipids form or help to form our cell membranes. So we have phospholipids. This is a phosphate head with lipid tails. So here's our phosphate head right here, and our lipid tails are here. There's 2 for every phosphate head. Now, here's some terms that you guys should have learned from the properties of water. The hydrophilic head, the phosphate head is hydrophilic. That means it loves water. The non-polar tails are hydrophobic. That means they don't like water. So remember, lipids are our fats, and fats or oils often repel water, so that's why they're considered hydrophobic. Okay, now lipids can be used for energy storage as well, but they're long-term energy storage. So fat is where that energy is stored. And eating more food than your body can convert to usable energy in an efficient amount of time and then use regularly, if your body can't do that, that leads to obesity. So if you're eating basically more energy than you're actually burning, then that causes you to be obese. Okay, now lipids also insulate, and I'm not talking about the kind of insulation you get from eating too much hamburgers. I'm talking about the insulation that's deep down in your cells, in your nerve cells. So lipids form something called myelin, and myelin is something that insulates your nerve cells. It's actually right along here, and it kind of gives them a little cushion. Now these are cushioned because we don't want to damage our nerve cells. If we damage our nerves, we don't get them back. They don't generate back. So we need to have a little protection on them, a little cushion, so if we have anything happen, we're not experiencing permanent nerve damage. Now, lipids also help to maintain body heat. So yes, there is some insulation related to those hamburgers that you've eaten. Now, they'll give us a little insulation on the outside, and they keep us and other organisms warm and help us regulate our body heat, which is really important for homeostasis. Now, if you're like this walrus, look at him. He's sitting in the ice. He totally needs to be warm, but he doesn't have a blanket. He doesn't have a snuggie. He's got to keep himself warm in other ways. And he does that by having that fat insulation very thick all over his body. Okay, now last one for lipids. Lipids can be hormones too. Now, steroids like testosterone, estrogen, progesterone are all steroid hormones, and they're involved in puberty and in reproduction, and those are all lipids. Okay, our last macromolecule. Now, all three of these on the list, the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the lipids, are all coming from things that we eat. Okay, so they're all coming from foods that we consume. Some of them we actually produce in our bodies, but we have to eat foods in order to have the building blocks to make those things that we're producing in our bodies. Now, the last one is something that we don't get from food. It's already in our bodies. We make it, it replicates itself, and we inherit it. And that's the nucleic acids. So nucleic acids contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So this is where phosphorus comes in, very important. And there's two kinds of nucleic acids. So you guys are going to worry a lot more about this when we do chapter 12 in the winter, talking about DNA and RNA. So DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, and RNA, ribonucleic acid, are the two types of nucleic acids that you guys will learn about. Now there's one other called ATP. And ATP is something we'll talk about when we start talking about cells and photosynthesis. Now ATP is our nucleic acid that stores and transports energy. And this is its basic structure. You guys don't have to worry about the structure for now, but later on I'll require that you know it. Okay, here are our other two functions. So DNA is in charge of storing our genetic information, and then RNA carries information from DNA out of the cell, and it helps with protein synthesis. So DNA is involved in making all of those proteins, or I'm sorry, RNA is involved in helping make all those proteins that our body requires. Okay, that's the end of our macromolecule slideshow. I hope that you guys learned a lot of information from it. Please feel free to go back and listen to it again, or again, break it up into chunks so that you're not watching it all at once. And also, bring your questions to class next week when we start talking about the macromolecules. These are some things that you guys will need to know. There's a little list, and please let me know if you have questions. Bye!